Well, good morning. Good to see all of your bright and shining faces. Okay, it's time to sit down, Neva. I'm kidding you. You can stand as long as you want. We are in Joshua chapter 11 today. My title slide there just says Joshua chapter 11, which could mislead you into thinking we're going to cover the whole chapter. And initially that was my intent, but there's too much stuff in here. At the end of the chapter we get into giants, the Anakim, and that could be a lesson all by itself. So my goal this morning is to cover the first 15 verses of Joshua chapter 11. We've got handouts coming around. I stood at the back and looked at this slide earlier and realized I couldn't read it from back there. And my distance vision is pretty decent, so I'm assuming most of you can't either. So this purple section is the subjection of the land. The following section will be when they divide it up between the tribes. That's the bulk of the book, actually. But here in the subjection of the land, we've got two sets, Jericho and Ai, which are the first two cities taken, major accomplishments. And then in the second section, which we're in now, we have the northern and southern campaigns, is what I've called them. You could call it conquest. So we're we already made it through the southern half, and now we get into the northern half. So that's where we're at in the book. Yeah, burgundy and pink. No, you're right. See, there's an artist in every crowd that knows their colors. I said purple. We'll go with burgundy and pink. You still can't really read it. I can read it from up here, but sorry about that. Let me just start by reading here. It's always a question of how much I want to read before I start talking, right? Difficult situation here. Joshua chapter 11 and verse 1. Then it came about when Jabin, king of Hatzor, heard of it, and that would be the conquest of the southern areas by the Israelites, that he sent to Jobab, king of Madon, and to the king of Shimron, and to the king of Akshaph, and to the kings who were of the north in the hill country, and in the Arabah, south of Kinnerot, and in the lowland, and on the heights of Dor on the west, and to the Canaanite on the east and on the west, and the Amorite, and the Hittite, and the Perizzite, and the Jebusite in the hill country, and the Hivite at the foot of Mount Hermon in the land of Mizpah. And they came out, they and all their armies with them, as many people as the sand that is on the seashore, and with very many horses and chariots. So all of these kings, having agreed to meet, came and encamped together at the waters of Merom to fight against Israel. Okay, so the first thing I want to note here, well, let me form it as a question. Who initiated the aggression in this situation? Who started the war? Yeah. This isn't Israel saying, let's go up and conquer the north. This is the kings of the north saying, let's pool our resources and go down and conquer Israel. Okay? I think that's kind of an important point. Let me say, first of all, these areas, I know some of you hate maps, and then there's those of us that can't function without them. So here we are. Hatzor is the uppermost circle. I realize the typeface on here is tiny. It's, okay, you can't see this online, but I'm going to get my pointer out. Here's Hatzor. The Sea of Galilee, which goes also by the name of Kinnerot. Shimron is down here just north of the Jezreel Valley, a few miles west of Nazareth, which was not really a village yet. We think Akshaf is up here. Dor we'll come to in a second over here. Merom and the waters of Merom are not too far off from Hatzor. This whole area is called Galilee in the New Testament. It's a mountainous area, kind of to the north and west of the Sea of Galilee that bears the same name. So that's kind of, those cities are kind of verse 1. Verse 2 then adds a few others. The heights of Dor, which we would take to be kind of the mountainous region here by Dor on the seashore. I forget what order it goes in, but I know we've got the lowlands, which would eventually be given to some of the tribes of Israel. The northern hill country, we had earlier the hill country in the south. The Arabah is the name of the Jordan River Valley. It's a giant rift valley, if you're into geography. And it actually runs all the way south down to the Red Sea and all the way north up into the mountains where the Hittites live. But in this particular area, it's often referred to in the Old Testament as the Arabah. So when you see that name, Arabah, that's the Jordan Rift Valley. And then he refers to the Hivites at the foot of Mount Hermon. Mount Hermon is clear up in the north. It's actually off of the map here, but they lived somewhere in that area. Point being, he's collecting everybody from everywhere to fight against Israel. And as the description is given here, I mean, it's the entire land. Who is left out that has not already been conquered? And, of course, no, I'll come to that in a second. This is the ancient site of Hatzor. Hatzor, he will refer to it later on in the chapter here as the head of all those nations. And it was the largest city in the entire Levant at this time. Over 200 acres, just the city by itself. My next slide is going to actually highlight for you the city. Can you see some stuff here that's been excavated and looks like some ancient buildings a little bit? Well, here's the actual extent of the entire city at this time in the late Bronze Age. So there's a massive lower city, and then this Acropolis that's in purple or violet or whatever Neva wants to call it. The upper city, it was reduced to only that size during the time of the kings of Israel. But at the time of Joshua, it was this massive 200-acre site. A city that large has significant resources. Maybe that goes without saying. Jabin is a fascinating one as well. There have been a number of different archaeological expeditions that have dug at Hatzor. And one of the most recent ones, they uncovered a little corner of a cuneiform tablet. It's actually quite tiny, about an inch by an inch. And it's fragmentary. It's the corner off of a larger tablet. But enough is preserved that we can read that it was written by a guy named Jabin, king of Hatzor. Now this comes from an earlier period, a few hundred years before the time of Joshua. Second interesting fact is that when Deborah and Barak in the book of Judges go to fight against enemies in the north, they also encounter a Jabin, king of Hatzor. So we have two options. One is that there was only one Jabin, and he lived back in the 18th century, and our texts are fiction that happened to get a name right. I don't buy into that theory. The other one is that the name Jabin was actually a dynastic name that kings at Hatzor used over and over and over again. And of course, we know of many other examples where that took place. Well, even among the kings of Israel and Judah, we have two Jeroboams of the northern kingdom. We have an Ahaziah of the north and of the south. We have a Jehoram of the north and the south. Oh boy, in Damascus we have Ben-Hadad, the first and the second and the third. Dynastic names like that are quite common. And so I'm convinced that's what's going on here. But I think it's cool that we found the name Jabin as a king of Hatzor on a tablet at Hatzor, even if it predates our time by a little ways. That's a lot of fun. They were artists, yeah. It's almost like reading one of these tiny print Bibles or something. Yeah, somebody had a very steady hand and a good eye in order to do that. And it's quite legible for people that can read Akkadian or Old Babylonian. Old Babylonian, I can't tell the difference looking at it. Yeah, they're just tiny. I should bring some. I've got a couple of casts of some stuff like this that you look at it and you're like, I can see the letters on there, but how can anybody make them that tiny with the tip of a reed and make it legible? It's pretty impressive. But yeah, it's just itty bitty. It's amazing to me that they even found it. Yeah. To read actual text there, yeah, it's pretty amazing. Scattered words. Let's see. Get you another map up here. I don't believe. Well, yes, I do. Madon, I've got that on the map that's on your handout at the same place as Merom. Those sound very different in English, Medan and Merom. In Hebrew, the letters are almost identical, the D and the There's just a little tail on one that distinguishes them. The M and the N are very similar. So it's possible that they're even referring to the same place, but if not, we don't know where that site is at, if it's some other place. I don't know that really matters either. I think I told you the location of Akshaf is a little uncertain as well. We've got it about here. I think he's got it down there. I could say this, though. We know of that city from a number of ancient texts, like the Egyptians. When they would come up here, one of the cities they recorded conquering in this area was Akshaf. So just because we can't put our finger on the map and say, there it is, doesn't mean it didn't exist. It appears in numerous other ancient documents. Yeah, Ghost Town. Well, we've probably looked at it and seen it and surveyed it. We just don't know that that's it, because there's multiple sites in that area. So, yeah, so it is. Let's see. His description here in verse 4 is fascinating. As many people as the sand that is on the seashore, and with very many horses and chariots. Innumerable. Massive army. And the Israelite army, by comparison, certainly by comparison, was small. This was not an even match. The Canaanites, if I can call them that, in the north, just had a boatload of warriors, horses, chariots, and Israel, by comparison, was a tiny force. But in verse 6, the Lord said to Joshua, "Don't be afraid of them, for tomorrow at this time I will deliver all of them slain before Israel, and you shall hamstring their horses and burn their chariots with fire. So we saw how God delivered the southern areas into the hands of the Israelites. In fact, there, he threw stones, hailstones at them to kill them. I mean, it was a miraculous thing. Here he just says, I'll deliver them into your hand. Don't be afraid. And given what they had experienced in the south, they have good cause to believe God, right? That he will do as he has said. He tells them to, oh man, I can show you a few of these. I don't know what you think of when you think of chariots and horses. This is about the time of Joshua. It's a crater, a Mycenaean bowl for holding wine, and it's got a nice little horse and chariot on the outside. Again, just about the time of Joshua. This one is about that time too. It's a model, right? A children's toy, perhaps. So normally the horses wouldn't have wheels under them. But kind of fun stuff. This one is a chariot of King Tut. They actually pulled 4 chariots out of his tomb in Egypt. And again, this is shortly after the time of Joshua, but shows you how lightweight they were built. Their construction was hopefully tough enough, but they wanted to keep the weight off of them too. And typically they were pulled by a team of 2 horses, although later on they'd graduate up to 4. Okay. Hamstring the horses. That's to cut a tendon in the back of their leg. I am not a veterinarian. What I understand is if you cut wrong, they're done. The leg just collapses, and you might as well knock them in the head. They didn't have 22s back then. But from what I understand, if you do it right, they can survive. They don't have that tendon to connect and use to use the muscle, and so they can't pull a chariot or carry a rider or that kind of thing. Connie was asking about this earlier, and I can't give you a reason why God didn't just say, kill the horses. He clearly does not want them to use the horses for any kind of purpose other than looking at. Yeah, eating your grass. Yeah, I don't know if I can say any more about that. Anybody know any more about hamstringing a horse? Yeah. As a reminder, yeah, that could be. We've got them around. We've disabled them, which perhaps, yeah, reminds me of some of the modern reminders that they have over there in Israel, where to commemorate the 6-Day War, a site at Latrun or wherever that's got tanks from that period that are all spread out. They're not functional anymore, but it's a reminder. So yeah, maybe something like that. And I think I've got, yes I do. I've got a question on the back of your handout that I want to answer. What's the purpose of this? Why not? I mean, they're considered to be valuable military assets. Why not hang on to them? Exactly. Yeah. Let me throw a couple verses at you here. Exodus 15, this is part of, I think this is Moses' song. It could be Miriam's. Sorry, I didn't look. I will sing to the Lord, for he is highly exalted. The horse and its rider he is hurled into the sea, celebrating the victory over Egypt. Victory. God's dealing with Egypt. They had boatloads of chariots and horsemen and foot soldiers, and God defeated them. It did not result in their victory at all. This verse doesn't say don't have chariots and horses, but it revels in God's defeat of those who had chariots and horses, much like we have here in Exodus, I think. Deuteronomy 20, verse 1, when you go out to battle against your enemies and see horses and chariots and people more numerous than you, that's this chapter, don't be afraid of them, for the Lord your God, who brought you up from the land of Egypt, that also had those kinds of equipment, He's with you. A Psalm of David here, Psalm 20 and verse 7. Some boast in chariots and some in horses, but we will boast in the name of Yahweh our God. That's the biblical perspective on this. One more, Isaiah 31 and verse 1. Woe to those who go down to Egypt for help and rely on horses and trust in chariots because they are many and in horsemen because they are very strong, but they do not look to the Holy One of Israel nor seek the Lord. Woe to those people. So yeah, Daniel, I think you're exactly right. God doesn't want the Israelites to collect the military equipment of their enemies and become known as a great nation because of their military hardware. He wants them to be known as a people who trust in God. And this is one way to do that. I could probably spend 20 minutes with you asking how that applies to us. But instead I'll just mention it in passing. How does it apply to us? John has a...
I think also the chariots were an offensive weapon for empires. When you take over other country after other country.
Yeah, an offensive weapon.
I think empires have always done pretty poorly. It always would have cost them far more than...
Yeah, trying to take over the world. Yeah, they don't need it. Should be a sign to nations even further out. Oh, you think you've got a big army and a lot of chariots and a lot of horses? Didn't work for them. So I'd challenge you to contemplate some of that. Are there things that we trust in rather than putting our faith and trust and time and energy and hope into God? Do we trust in politics, politicians? Do we trust in business stuff, the amassing of wealth for ourselves? Something to think about. Okay. Verse 7, Joshua 11 and verse 7. So Joshua and all the people of war with him came upon them suddenly by the waters of Merom and attacked them. This is a little different map than what you've got. I wanted to throw it up there because he also gives the possibility that the waters of Merom are up further north up the Arabah around the Lake Hula, which is mostly drained today. But that's another possible place. But I think most likely it's where the center is on this map. It's a hilly region. I didn't really give you a picture of that, did I? It's a hilly region and a bit rocky where chariots wouldn't be the most useful. Chariots function best on flat ground. And it's possible that these kings wanted to initiate battle somewhere more advantageous to themselves. But it sounds like Joshua came up on them by surprise, attacked them before they were ready, came upon them suddenly. Verse 8, and the Lord delivered them into the hand of Israel, so that they defeated them and pursued them as far as Great Sidon and Mitzrapoth-Maim and the valley of Mitzpah to the east, and they struck them until no survivor was left to them. Here's an old picture of Sidon. Of course, today it's on the seashore. Today, it's just a massive metropolis, which would just look like a modern city. So I thought, well, this is a little better depiction of what it might have looked like back in that day when we had airplanes, but they hadn't moved the city to such a great size. This is a Google Earth map, and if I can get my pointer out here again, here's Hatzor. I was showing you Beit Shan. Here's Hatzor, Merom, Sidon up the coast. Maybe you can see Tyre sticking out here. Here's Mount Hermon. There's a question what Greater Sidon means. It could mean like the great city Sidon, or it could mean the territory owned by Sidon, kind of like Greater Omaha takes in all these what's the word I'm looking for? Suburbs. Thank you. But they apparently chased him quite a ways. I think I'll let most of the rest of that go. Mount Hermon, you know where that's at. Verse 9, and Joshua did to them as the Lord had told him, and he hamstrung their horses and burned their chariots with fire. That's a good thing. He must have overcome the urge to keep all this stuff. And the Israelites were with him on it. Obedience to a direct command of God is always a good thing. Verse 10, then Joshua turned back at that time and captured Hatzor and struck its king with the sword, for Hatzor formerly was the head of all these kingdoms. Verse 11, and they struck every person who was in it with the edge of the sword, utterly destroying them. There was no one left who breathed, and he burned Hatzor with fire. Another photo here of Hatzor. Like I said earlier, the city has been excavated, little parts of it, a number of times by different archaeologists. And there are several destruction layers in the late bronze strata. One of them belongs to Joshua and the Israelites at this point. There's a later one, which is the final level of the Canaanite city that apparently was brought about by Deborah and Barak when they defeated and burned the city in the Judges period. That's 13th century or so. I don't know if you can't really see from this picture. Does this look like just a hillside and a little valley? You can see the road running through the valley down below. What this actually is a rampart, an earthen rampart built at Hatzor during the Middle Bronze Age. By hand, with baskets, they dug out that valley and piled it up as a massive berm around the edge of the city. I don't know how many millions of cubic feet of dirt they moved, but it was a bunch. It actually defines the city. And then there would have been a city wall built on top of that berm. All of that just to say the city had impressive defenses. This was not a place where you'd go up and knock on the gate, and if they don't let you in, you barge through. Huge, huge city with massive walls, massive city gate, and God gave it to the Israelites. They don't describe how that took place. If a foreign, like the Assyrians, were coming in and trying to take this, they would probably build a siege ramp and try to get their siege equipment up to knock down part of the wall. Who knows? Bring in ladders. I don't know what they would have done. And we don't know how Joshua accomplished this, except that God gave it to him. And they destroyed it. It does specifically mention here at the end of verse 11 that he burned Hatzor with fire. And I've said it a few times, that's only said of 3 cities: Jericho, Ai, and Hatzor. Those are the only 3 that they burned with fire, destroyed that way. So it's a significant event. Verse 12, Joshua captured all the cities of these kings and all their kings, and he struck them with the edge of the sword and utterly destroyed them, just as Moses, the servant of the Lord, had commanded. However, Israel did not burn any cities that stood on their mounds except Hatzor alone, which Joshua burned. Now, I would take that to mean in this northern campaign, because it's specifically stated earlier that he did burn Jericho and Ai, but that's not part of this event. I think it's easy to see. You're feeling this too. Verse 11, there was no one left who breathed. Verse 12, he utterly destroyed them. We have a few different statements like this. What does that mean? You could walk away thinking there were no living Canaanites left in the land, right? But that's not what he intends here. We know that from a few different ways. A lot of these areas had to be reconquered after this. Well, I just told you Deborah and Barak had to reconquer Hatzor. So apparently there were people who escaped, hid in caves and forests and whatever, and eventually filtered back in. Why did they filter back in? Israel didn't have enough people to take. They took these places, but they didn't establish themselves there yet. Burned the city and walked away. The Israelites were not numerous enough yet. So this is the second set of references on the back here. Handout, sorry. Trying to read and talk at the same time. I just want to give you 2 references here. The Lord did not set his love on you, Israel, nor choose you because you were more in number than any of the peoples, for you were the fewest of all peoples. We often don't take that into account when we think of the Israelites. But Moses says here in Deuteronomy that they were not a large nation, and I would assume that's by comparison with the other nations around here. But they were a small people. In Exodus 23, God says, I will send hornets ahead of you so that they will drive out the Hivites, Canaanites, Hittites before you. I will not drive them out before you in a single year, that the land may not become desolate and the beasts of the field become too numerous for you. I will drive them out before you little by little until you become fruitful and take possession of the land. If this entire area had been totally depopulated, it would have become overgrown with weeds and junk and briar, and the wild animals would have taken over it because the Israelites were not numerous enough yet to populate it all. So there were some leftover Canaanites, Hittites, Hivites, Jebusites that eventually filtered back in and re-inhabited these cities for a time. And the way I would understand these statements, and we'll have a few more later on, about Joshua leaving no one who breathed, that kind of thing, is that is a true statement of the people that they met or interacted with. It's not an absolute statement that there was no one left in the entire land that breathed, but that everybody they met, they killed. And part of that, well, I'll come to that in verse 14. Verse 13 first. However, Israel did not burn any cities that stood on their mounds except Hatzor alone, which Joshua burned. 14. All the spoils of these cities and the cattle the sons of Israel took as their plunder, but they struck every man with the edge of the sword until they had destroyed them, and they left no one who breathed. 15. Just as the Lord had commanded Moses his servant, so Moses commanded Joshua, and so Joshua did. He left nothing undone of all that the Lord had commanded. So they took spoil. Conquer a city, kill the king, kill any military men that you can find that come up against you or that you can chase down, and then plunder the area. And here again, I think we can see God giving them stuff. They've been wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. Probably don't have massive numbers of cattle, donkeys, sheep, goats, chickens, cats. But this is their big opportunity, right? They go in and take these places, and here's all this livestock and other stuff, stuff in houses and whatnot. Are they killing just military men or the entire population? It sounds to me like pretty much anybody they run into, which could go beyond just military men. In fact, I would expect it would in some cases. In a couple of weeks, I keep putting this off. In a couple of weeks, I want to address the question with you specifically of the morality of this. I have a number of things to say about that, and I don't want to totally go down that road yet. But I think it's a legitimate question, and I think there are some really good answers for that too. But it's something that I think, especially in our day and age, can make us uncomfortable. But it is my intent to address that. Yeah, high places were spread. They were often in cities, but there were high places that were outside of town too, apparently. We get more description of that actually in the later books. Yeah, that's a good question why it's not mentioned here. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, every one of these would have had religious centers. Every one of these villages or cities would have had religious centers. Some would have had an actual temple building. Some would have just had a little cult place with standing stones and a little altar and stuff like that. But yeah, I would kind of assume, but the text just doesn't give us information on that. So, so a little more here on this statement: they left none who breathed. Judges 1 lists a whole bunch of places that were conquered after Joshua died. And the text will tell us in the end of this chapter, they waged war with these kings for a long time. Again, you can get the misimpression that this all happened in a week and then they were done. but the text will clarify that later on in this chapter. The fact that they're still conquering places after Joshua's death tells me they hadn't conquered all these places yet. They hadn't conquered every single city. Otherwise, the statements there in Judges make no sense. The second part of Judges 1 lists a bunch of places that were not conquered. That's kind of interesting. There were places the Israelites just simply did not take. In Judges 4, that's Deborah and Barak again. Hatzor and its coalition of other cities has to be defeated again. Where did these people come from? I thought every one of these cities was absolutely decimated. There were people living in Hatzor again a century later, and a Canaanite king that ruled over it. Judges chapter 19 tells us that Jerusalem was a Canaanite city at that point. The Levite goes past it and doesn't want to stop the night there. He said, let's stop at an Israelite city. And of course, we know it remained a Canaanite city until David took it centuries after this. So I would suggest that these statements, they left no one who breathed, and statements like that are telling us that they killed everyone they came into contact with. The flip side of that coin is they didn't make a peace treaty with any of these people like they had with the Gibeonites. And they weren't supposed to make a peace treaty with any of these people. And so from that perspective, this is a good thing. They didn't let people go and say, oh, you can keep living in our land. No, instead, they eradicated everybody that they came across. Doesn't mean the entire region was depopulated. It means they didn't make peace with anybody. Yeah. Yes. I would absolutely agree with you. Like Hatzor, anybody that was in there, they killed. You know, there are always people who are out of town. I'm a Hatzor resident. I'm taking a trip up to Damascus to do some business. I'll be back in 3 weeks. And in that time, the city's gone. Well, what are you going to do? And now the Israelites have gone back down to Gilgal. Eventually, they're going to send out guys to spy out the land, survey the land, and they'll by lot they'll decide who's gets what territory, and then they'll move into those territories. But they haven't done that yet. So the city's destroyed and vacant, and you come home from Damascus. Go live with my aunt or something. I mean, eventually somebody's going to want to rebuild, and they do. But yes, absolutely, I agree with you. Everybody they run into, they destroy. And in a city like Hatzor, whoever's in the city, they wipe them out. And again, I think the key there is they're not making peace with anybody, which is exactly what they were supposed to do. You don't make peace with these people. And we'll come back and address that a little more later on as well. Okay, fill in the blanks on your points to ponder here. God's direction to destroy the captured horses and chariots emphasized reliance on Him alone, and we hit that early on in this chapter. I think that's a significant spiritual, theological point, and one that we all need to cogitate about how that applies to us. Are there things we rely on in place of God. It's not going to be chariots and horses for us. It's going to be something different. Number 2, the text states repeatedly that Joshua obeyed God. And I think we should understand this as directly leading to their victory over this people that were like the sand of the seashore, just innumerable. A foe that would otherwise, you'd say, there's no way. But they obeyed God, and they were able to overcome them. And then last point, I think that careful reading of the text moderates the view that the conquest involved the destruction of all the cities and all the people of Canaan. You can get that impression just surface reading it, but I think when you stop and read it carefully and compare it to other scripture, it's good to modify that just a bit. Not what the text says, but moderate our understanding of what that means, what the author intended there, that Israel was faithful in not making peace covenants or treaties with the Canaanites, the indigenous people. I see that hand. Uh-huh. There would have been indigenous peoples on the other side of the Jordan that half of Manasseh and Gad and Reuben left their little ones and wives there. That would have taken a step of faith. I would suspect that they had a little bit of military force back up there too, but yeah, that would be kind of a scary thing to commit yourself to go help your brothers take their land. Yeah. Seeing no other hands, I'll close in prayer. Lord, we're so grateful to you for the way that you took care of your people. We see you fulfilling your promises to them in this chapter. I pray that we would take a lesson away from that you are true to your word, and that you care for those who belong to you, and that you help us, that you are pleased when we obey, and that you fulfill your word and expect obedience out of us. And I pray that we would search our own hearts and minds. Each of us is sinful, and we confess that to you and ask for your forgiveness. And we are so grateful for the forgiveness that you freely give when we come to you. Pray that you would bless us now as we move into the service. In your name, amen.